Thank you very much. And while I'm sharing my screen, let me first of all thank Kiet and NRC for inviting me to speak today at this seminar. And also let me thank the chairperson of NRC, Dr. Jung Haegu, and Kiet presidents Ye Hong-ju, for the kind introduction and for raising important issues that I'm going to mention at today's seminar, and for mentioning also, and let me thank Kiet again, the very active involvement of Kiet in both the CIIE and the Working Party on Industry Analysis, where Kiet is representing Korea on the Bureau of both these bodies of the OECD. So thank you for that. And as Chairperson Jung Haegu mentioned, we are living in a world that experiences several transitions right now, and I would say also several challenges, whether from a health point of view, from an economic point of view, but also a geopolitical one. And industrial policy can play an important role for ensuring growth. We are seeing a slowdown across the board. As it was said, I'm the secretariat of the Committee on Industry, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship. And the mandate is very much and supporting governments in developing policy mixes and in particular industrial strategies, I should say, that empower countries to navigate this transition, whether it's digital, green, post-recovery, post-COVID recovery, and as I said, the geopolitical challenges of, for example, energy autonomy and energy independence. And the idea is really to do this, to succeed in this transition, ensuring growth and ensuring sort of, in particular, productivity, inclusive productivity growth. Now, just to say, how do we do this? And let me perhaps mention two main pillars, I should say three main pillars of our work. The first one is very much about providing evidence-based. And President of Kiet mentioned, Dynamp, Multiprod, AI Diffuse. We can even mention Microbird, where we try to evaluate the effectiveness of R&D tax credit. But we also provide what I call a public good, which is probably well known also in Korea, to really provide indicators that capture the evolution of industry dynamics and globalization, such as TAN, the TIVA indicators, the trade in employment, and more recently, trade in embodied CO2. These, as I said, are public good, so every government can access this information, and it's quite unique because it uses inter-country input-output table, and this infrastructure is developed in our committee. We then have a second pillar that really tries to analyze this data. And for example, here I mentioned entrepreneurship and transition in particular, as I will mention later on in the presentation. We have a new developed work on innovation and industrial policies in support of the low carbon transition, but also to look at how governments can support startups to contribute to climate change. And then we have a whole set of work really looking at what I call the new industrial policy and new industrial strategies, which again, I'm going to talk more in detail. We also have a third pillar, which is about communication and convening. So in addition to our working paper, we have key flagship publication. And for example, let me mention a joint work that we do on World Corporate Top R&D Investors. And this last year's edition really focused again on climate neutrality. And here we really focus on the big players. So let me mention in Korea, for example, Samsung, but not only. So these really focus on what I call the top of the distribution. And then in addition to flagship publication, we have this convening activity that we implement, the CI implement via the Global Forum on Productivity. And we will have the new, this year's annual conference in Brussels on the 7th and 8th of July. And if you're interested, you can connect remotely. There will be speeches exactly on the 3 issues we are discussing today: the green transition, the digital transformation with a keynote of John Varinen from LSE, and then sessions also on the post-COVID recovery. Now, let me now get more into the substance. This was just, I think, important to stress that everything we do, it's quite broad and it's quite complex, but everything is really trying to feed into the main mandate of the CIE, which is provide evidence-based to advise governments on how best to design industrial policies for growth in this era of transition. So everything you will see today is really about trying to achieve this goal. Now, the first question is very much about growth and, trying to provide, I would say, if you think of the productivity growth slowdown as a disease, try to, first of all, explore the symptoms. And then secondly, once we have clear what the symptoms are, trying to suggest potential cures for this disease. So the first big question has been over time, the question of increasing divergences across countries. And thanks to the collaboration with Kiet, we are seeing similar figures also for Korea. We have seen that productivity dispersion across OECD countries has increased. And this increase in dispersion, and here what I report on the left-hand side is the 90-10 ratio in multi-factor productivity in both manufacturing and market services, is driven as well, or is being accompanied by a slowdown in the speed of catch-up of lagging firms relative to frontier firms. So that's the first, if you want, symptom. Increased divergence, slowing catch-up rate. Second symptoms, we see that while exit rate, and this is again the figures on your right, on the right of the screen, sorry. You see the entry rate in gray have basically been stagnating. We see that entry rates and job reallocation rates have actually declined over time. So what this is a symptom of is slowing dynamism in the economy. And this slowing dynamism at the, I would say, bottom of the distribution. So, the less productive firms who don't exit, or the new sometimes high potential entrants not coming into the market as fast, has been accompanied by an increase in concentration at the top of the distribution. So what we see in the graph on your on the right of the screen, you see that the share of sales accounted for by the 10% largest firms in both manufacturing and services is becoming larger and larger relative to the rest of the business population. So this is very much, again, a symptom, and this increase in concentration is coming as well with a big increase in mergers and acquisition, both whether I look at numbers of deal and value of deals. Value of deal, you see is number in red, which is more volatile because, as you know, M&A values can be quite lumpy, and an increase in markups. Now, again, the increase in markup that we see is very much driven by the top 10% of the markup distribution. So you really see this dichotomy appearing in the economy, this big divergence coming whether you look at productivity, whether we look at markup, whether we look at concentration. Now, the big question, I mean, these are the symptoms. Let's try to understand, what these symptoms mean. And so let's try to understand why this is happening. So in our analysis, the focus has really been on globalization on one side, but even more, I should say, on digital transformation and the shifts to a knowledge economy. A knowledge economy where intangible assets and tacit knowledge have become more and more important. So why are we focusing on this? Because I mean, in theory, you might think that digital technologies, because they lower entry costs, they make the sharing of ideas easy. You don't need to have a high number of employees to produce. Should actually ease market penetration and therefore should be accompanied by higher entry rate, lower dispersion, and so on. But the important caveat to this is that if you want to succeed as a firm from the digital transformation, you really achieve it only if you have or you are implementing complementary investments such as human capital, such as for example, investment in data, investment in software, investment in management, and so on. And most of these complementary investment actually are based on tacit knowledge. So, having a good manager is not something that you can necessarily train. Some of the knowledge that is not codified in patents, you are not going to acquire unless you have developed it. And once you start having this advantage, because you have all this tacit knowledge, you have the human capital, you have the management and the organizational capital, these are very much intangibles that are non-rival, but are also scalable, and they really require a sunk investment at the beginning. So this is not something that every firm can do, and every firm has the incentives to do, because if you don't have the scales, the sunk investment is too costly, and you're not going to implement it. Finally, we also know that many of these digital services, especially, benefit from economies of scale and scope, but also network externalities. And these network externalities really what drives and what can reinforce this winner takes most dynamics that we observe. And this is true both in services, but also for manufacturing firms. Think also of the role of branding and reputation that sort of can scale up beyond borders. So, what we find is that actually digital transformation may translate in barriers to diffusion, to less productive firms, can lower experimentation amongst this group of less productive firms, and it might lower dynamism. And while at the same time, the larger firms who have these complementary assets actually are the ones that gain market share and apply markups. So this is something that we have explored more. And let me show you, for example, some of this evidence. So as we said, you can gain a lot from digital transformation, and this is exactly what we see. Productivity tends to be higher in sectors that are both higher in terms of intangible intensity and digital intensity. And this is exactly what you see here across countries, across all of, not all, some selected countries in the OECD. So very much this is what we observe, that they are higher than the average. The second, higher than other sectors relative to the non-agricultural. The average labor productivity in other industry in the non-agricultural business sector. Secondly, and this is exactly the point I was trying to make, when I was explaining what was going on, we see that sectors that have high intangible intensity are the ones where this dispersion that I showed you at the beginning is actually higher. We also see that the sectors where there is more knowledge intensity are the ones where laggards can catch up at a lower speed. So again, this is a bit of a problem, and we use different measures of knowledge intensity, digital intensity, high skill intensity, an identifier for knowledge intensive sector. So you really see across the board that catch up is lower in sectors that are higher in these different characteristics. Entry rates are again lower in this digital intensive sector. And finally, you also see that increasing concentration is higher in the sector. So all of the measures that I showed to you at the beginning in terms of what's happening in the economy, we see that this is very much more of a problem when I look at a digital intensive sector. And let me close also with markups and M&A. Again, you see this picture is exactly the same. Digital intensive sector are the ones that have seen these increasing markups and the divergence in markups increasing over the first decade of the 2000s, and M&As again have increased much more. And I can tell you that even during COVID-19, these figures have actually worsened. I mean, we have looked at M&A and you see that the picture has become even, the difference between high digital intensive acquisition and non-digital intensive acquisition has even become starker, the difference between the two. Now, I already explained a bit of this, and let me, I mean, this is just a recap of what I just said. If there are no questions, I'm going to go on the next section of the presentation, but feel free to interrupt me if you have any question up to now. I cannot see you, but please feel free to interrupt me if something is not clear. So one of the things we decided to do, because we know that AI is very much the next frontier of technology, is really to really understand what's going on with digital technology diffusion when we focus on AI in particular. Now, how do we do this? As I said, we first need to understand the symptoms. So we wanted to characterize the digital transformation. We wanted to shed light on the factors that enable this digital transformation, in particular, as I said, the use of skills, the bundle of digital technologies that sort of underlying the adoption of AI, and the role of intangibles. And this will then help us better understand the implication for productivity growth, productivity distribution, and therefore also inclusiveness. To do this, we use different approaches, and that to me is also a big strength of the work that we do in CIE. Thanks to the contribution of countries like Korea and institutions like Kiet, we have developed and we can continue relying on distributed microdata analysis. And for example, for AI, we have this project called AI Diffuse that relies on ICT surveys. Why is this methodology important? Is because we use, if you want, the same data protocol, the same codes on, similar, but not exactly the same data sources across countries. This ensures cross-country comparability, ensures often representativeness of what we do across countries. So this is a big strength of CIE. And again, I'm very thankful to Jehan and to Kiet and Dr. Gill for this. The second way we do it is really trying to exploit big data. Obviously, we cannot always do it. It depends on the coverage of commercial data sources here, but we use different data sources to identify and characterize different firms. And for example, in the case of AI, we look at AI adopters defined in different way. And then the third approach is really to go country specific and to go and have in-depth studies. In the past, as I would mention, we have done an in-depth study of Korea, the inclusive growth review of Korea that we did jointly with other parts of the OECD. For digital technologies, we have done a country-specific review of Italy. Now, This is exactly what I was mentioning about the distributed microdata project. And here the question is how firm size, age, and sector of activity, but also productivity, are linked to technology adoption. And here I think the key words is very much about complementarities. Why? Because I mean, it's important to understand when we design policies, whether by, I would say, doing less, but on several, I would say, aspects of the digital transformation might be even more beneficial than focusing on a single, let's say, element of the digital transformation, let's say hardware, and not do anything on the rest. So the returns to that policy might be lower than doing perhaps a bit less, but on hardware, on software, on digital infrastructures, on skills, on innovation, etc. And that's why it's important as well that we can go beyond AI and can look at several technologies, some of them being really at the frontier of technology development, some of them being a bit older. And that's exactly what we can do with the ICT survey. And we already have some preliminary findings from pilot countries, and we are expanding the coverage. And let me thank again Jehan for all the efforts that he has made on this. Perhaps let me, I think it's important to talk also about results today. What we find, and perhaps unsurprisingly, is that larger firms are really, if you want, the pioneer of AI adoption. But what I think is also interesting is that conditional on size is actually the younger firms that are very much ahead in technology adoption. We also find important complementarities, in particular with skills and with previous experience with technology adoption. So these are important results, and I think can really help in designing policy, and for example, in stressing the importance of institutions such as university in the digital adoption. These are the different data. I mentioned this already. Let me say that at the moment we have a preliminary result using this combination of different data sources coming, for example, from job postings platforms such as Burning Glass data that really allows us to understand the development of AI skills, data on intellectual property rights. In particular, we have in-house data on patenting and trademarks and websites. So at the moment, we have focused on the UK, but the approach is very much scalable. It's just a matter of resources because, as you can imagine, this is extremely expensive to start with, but also, I would say, quite human capital intensive. I already mentioned some of these. Let me also go on two important issues that I didn't mention before: the role of skills and the role of market size, which to me it's particularly important because, as you know, with the recent COVID and the recent energy crisis, I would call it, we are all trying to go back to let's do everything at home. Sort of this reshoring or nearshoring is becoming quite important, but we see that for the development and the adoption of technology, market size still plays a very important role. So openness remains very important. And let me close on the skills, where we see that, yes, it's important to have ICT training and to have ICT specialists. However, we should not forget in the bundles that we need for AI development, social-emotional skills. These are particularly important because we need to work more in teams. We also know that now with telework, these are becoming more important. And this might also push for an important role that women can also play in the development and the use of AI in the economy. Now, the final question for us was not just, it's not just adoption per se, but it's very much about the link between AI adoption and AI use and productivity, as I said. Now, as you all know, we are seeing a productivity slowdown, and there is a big debate on whether this is a temporary or a long-term issue, is whether the digital transformation is actually not resulting in any productivity improvement. That's the argument, for example, of Gordon and I would call techno-pessimists. Now, another strand of the literature which is gaining, I would say, momentum is the one pushed very much by Eric Brynjolfsson, and he recently wrote this paper with Daniel Rock and Chad Syverson, where he really explained that, yes, we might see a decline in productivity, which is very normal because we need to adapt and adjust. But we know that when we have general purpose technology, we normally see an S curve, but for AI, we actually see a J curve because it takes time, number one, for the productivity gains to realize, but also because of measurement issues. So again, this seems very much in line with our results, because as I said, for now, we see that it's mainly large firms that adopt, and the ones that adopt are very much more productive. But we also see that these firms are also the ones that do this complementary investment. So when we look at productivity in the aggregate, we might not see the returns in terms of productivity to AI having really materialized. So I think I've shown you the symptoms. I'm trying to get to the causes. I hope you saw the digital transformation as being one of the potential causes and the need of this the complementary intangible investments. And so, the question is, can we advise governments on what to do, given that we have identified the symptoms and, if you want, the disease in a way. And to me, when we did this in this recent paper and report that we did for the Italian government, which has really analyzed these different elements, looking at the Italian ecosystem of firms, and what we have identified, and I mentioned this before, the importance of complementarities, and in particular worker skills, but also management capabilities. We know that Italy, as you may know, has many micro and small firms, and so there is a big problem of management quality. And then thirdly, the role of this complementary investment in intangibles, which again, Italy is lagging behind, for example, other countries on investment in R&D and quality of local universities. And for this reason, public policy can really help and can really change things through STEM education, through policies that can provide training for improving managerial skills, but also changing the selection in which managers are selected. As you know, family firms sometimes choose their managers not based on quality, but based on, as we say in Italian, surname. So if you're a member of the family or not, and we know that family-owned and family-managed firms perform worse than family-owned and non-family managed businesses. So this is something where policies that go beyond industrial policy, could be policy on inheritance, tax policy, and so on, can really make a difference. And then thirdly, as I said, public support to R&D, can really support as it improves the investment in intangible. And since complementarity is an important factor, complementarity in policy intervention is going to be crucial, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. So we mentioned skills and human capital and intangibles. Digital infrastructure is also very important, which I know it's not, for example, probably as much as an issue in Korea, but in Italy is very much an issue, speed of broadband and so on, to really allow firms to recoup the investment that they might do in terms of both digital technologies, but also digital skills and digital management. Finally, obviously, credit and financing we find is also important. And again, this links to policies on competition in the banking sector, availability of venture capital, and so on. So I think the important message here is that industrial policies and industrial strategy cannot operate in a vacuum, but need to coordinate with other policy areas, because productivity policies are very much encompassing. And so, we go from education and training to, as I said, infrastructure to financing. So this is to me the most important message. If you just get this out of my talk today, I would be more than happy. Now, why did I want to focus on this? Is because since I took over in terms of being responsible of the Secretariat, we try to push much more the debate also within the CIE on the role of public policies to capture with structural change, and really try to better define and better understand industrial policy. So why is this important? Because industrial policy has made a comeback. I mean, until a few years ago, we shouldn't have mentioned industrial policy in many OECD countries, but now I think that there is wide recognition that industrial policy is important, and Korea, I think, is a very nice example on how good industrial policy can really make a big difference in the development and in the growth of a country. But there is an absence of a common reference, what we mean by industrial policies, and this complicates the debate. So what are we doing at the CIE about this? We are contributing with a conceptual framework, and then we have several applications at the country level, at the sectoral level. We have a technology focus, but we also look at different goals: sustainable development goals, green transition and climate neutrality, inclusive growth, productivity, and so on. And then finally, we also contribute to this by focusing on evaluating particular tools. And, the example that I made is R&D tax credit, but, my hope is that we can do more of this, I would say, application to particular policy tools. So let me start, and again, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. Also, if I'm speaking too fast for the translators, because when I get, excited about what I'm talking about. So could you confirm that the speed is okay for you?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, thank you. So let me talk about the industrial policy framework that we have developed. So we wanted to start by providing a broad definition of industrial policy. Why? Because we wanted to provide a coherent framework for conceptualizing industrial policy intervention. And so, on the one hand, we wanted to limit their scope, but at the same time, we wanted to recognize that industrial policies encompass all types of instruments that intend to structurally improve the performance of the domestic business sector. What this means is that this will include business support measures such as science, technology, and innovation policies, but also, for example, entrepreneurship policies. Secondly, and this is an important point, in our definition and in our framework, industrial policy is not just restricted to the manufacturing sectors, but concerns the whole private business sector. And, the idea of being so broad, both in terms of interventions and in terms of sectoral coverage, is really to include a vast set of targeted, but also horizontal policies, which normally we don't necessarily define in the old framework as industrial policy. Now, one important point that it's important to make, I think, these are all the goals that they have. Now, One important point that I would like to make, while in our definition of industrial policy, we do not include, obviously, tax policy, competition policy, trade and investment policies, the two need to go hand in hand. And the example that I made on Italy, I think, is a nice one. So if you want to have effective industrial policy, you need to coordinate with competition policymakers. You need to interact in the tax policy arena. You need to coordinate with your trade and investment, discussions and so on. So let me close this slide with two important points that I would like to make. One is, by this definition that we adopt, I would say virtually any government has always implemented some type of industrial policy to some extent. Second main point that I hope you get from these slides is that the objective of industrial policy, so the performance of the business sector, is seen today as a multidimensional entity. So it's not just about productivity and innovation, but especially after COVID, is also about resilience, is about inclusive development and SDGs. It's about dealing with the green transition and strategic autonomy. So that's what makes industrial policies and industrial strategies today complex and difficult, both to implement, but also to evaluate. And I think there needs to be a recognition that, the world is becoming more complex and policy with it. So let me go on and trying to explain our framework, because I think it's quite important on how we distinguish, if you want, the components of industrial strategies. And we start by recognize that industrial policy instruments, which we define as tools used by policymakers to achieve better performance in the business sector, can be of different type. So the first one is the channel through which they operate. So we can have tools that affect the demand directly through regulation, public procurement, awareness campaign, or they can affect the supply. And they can affect the supply in different ways. So when we think of aggregate, for example, let me start with one of the goals, aggregate productivity growth. You can achieve that through improving the performance of single firms. Think of, you can improve the productivity growth of firm X by giving them investment incentives to do more R&D, more training, export, and so on and so forth. Or you can you can also improve aggregate productivity by supporting the growth of better firms. So by shifting resources to these firms, okay? And in particular, the most common mechanism here is reallocation of resources, or, for example, supporting this neo-Schumpeterian process of creative destruction, where you say, okay, the least productive firms leave the market, and we have new, better firms, younger firms, more innovative, more productive coming into the market. Or you allow for mobility of workers across firms, and you allow a better match of, for example, labor in the labor market. So, in this case, your instrument should be, capital markets that are well functioning, labor mobility, entrepreneurship policies, and so on and so forth. Obviously, all of these instruments, all of these policy tools need to be in a way governed in a way that is efficient. So governance instruments, which I put here at the bottom, are very much complementary through these different demand and supply interventions, because they need to coordinate in an efficient way stakeholders in the business sectors, the public sector, the research institutions, and so on. And so it's very much important to have this effective governance. And I would say that the ongoing, the recent health crisis and the ongoing challenges in the geopolitical situation really highlight the importance not only of domestic coordination, but also international cooperation. And they also reinforce, when we think of the crisis, they reinforce the importance of this multi-level governance at the national level. So what cities and regions do needs to be aligned and well coordinated, also together with the national level. So this is really very much an important point in our framework. Now, when we have described the tools, then we wanted to describe the strategies. So the strategies, as I said, are a set of consistent and articulated group of policy instruments, and they're aimed at achieving particular policy objectives that, as I said, can go beyond growth and innovation. So you can think of strategic autonomy, sustainability, resilience. And so this is very much what drives the development of new industrial strategies that are increasingly focused not only on growth, but also on specific technologies, and also I would say on specific missions. So this is very much how we integrate the whole new idea of mission-oriented industrial strategies. Let me make an example here. Think of the AI industrial strategy, which you might have heard mentioned, in various policy arena. When we think about an artificial intelligence leadership strategy, you need to combine R&D grants, training programs, innovative public procurement, sectoral industry boards. So you see, this is very much something that requires, again, good governance, good coordination across boards. Let me close this session by also providing you with key messages and advice that we will give to governments if they came to us on how to best design industrial strategy. To me, message number one, and this really, as I said, the key word for me today is complementarities. We saw complementarities amongst different technology and so on and so forth, but also complementarity between policy instruments. And the reason why this is important is because of these complementarities, we can really justify the use of the development of industrial strategies because of the importance of using in a coherent and coordinated way different policy instruments that go beyond the industrial strategy. One, we need to have appropriate framework conditions. We talked about, for example, market size and openness before, but also competition, regulation, and so on. Second, and here I think it's important to talk about two things: good policy design and good policy governance. Second main message: there is no shame in using targeted industrial strategies. They can be very helpful to direct technological change and growth, in particular when we have societal challenges such as climate change. And in a way, to me, they also justify this renewal of the importance of mission-oriented strategy. So this is very important. That said, when we use targeted industrial strategy, again, the devil is in the detail. We should not forget that there are very well-known and well-identified pitfalls of this targeted intervention. And so, again, we need to be careful about, for example, not leaving anyone behind, or if you want, not excluding particular firms, for example, potential new entrants or young competitors, especially in sectors where you have big incumbents. We should really think about specifying objectives rather than means. And, although difficult, it is important to really factor in an ex-ante phase, ex-post assessment and ex-post evaluation, and put this evaluation and the results of this evaluation, state them clearly how they will change the policy. So it's important to build in exit options.
Yeah.
Rehan, I can anyway stop here. I mean, I said everything I wanted to say. The slides go in much more details about other things. I mean, I'm happy to answer questions. I think, on the slides or on specific issues, but I realize I spoke for a long time. I got a bit carried away. So I just stop here, and I let you perhaps come back to me on some of these issues, if you have any questions. Thank you, President, and thank you for your very interesting questions. So let me answer all four of them. I mean, I identified 4 questions. So the first one, I would say, if I understand correctly, is the role of national level industrial policy in smaller economies versus larger economies. So for me, this relates very much to the point, I don't know if you have heard that point on governance and multi-level governance. So, and then I'll go to your second question of the broader, but let's assume we take this broader concept of industrial policy, this broader definition of industrial policy that we have used, and I can make some examples. You need to have a coordination, especially in larger countries, between national level and local level implementation of industrial policies, or at least a coordination between regional and local level policies with national level ones. Let me make an example. In the current project that we have on industrial policy, we have one country which is included, which is Canada. And Canada, for example, is a country where you have some policies done at the national levels, some policies sort of done at the regional level, and some policies that are, if you want, done at the national, designed at the national level, but implemented at the regional level. So to me, this multi-level governance becomes more and more important the bigger the country. Okay. Your second point, and I think is an important one that you made on this, was, okay, let's think of small countries. Why are we worried about national versus, I would say, a more international type of approach? To me, that's particularly important because we need exactly to make the point that, yes, you can have a national industrial policy, but especially if you're a small country, you need to have international coordination. And, like we saw it, for example, let me make a hands-on example now. We saw that in Europe, the only way, for example, we got out of the COVID crisis, I mean, even though it's not strictly an industrial policy, but it is to some extent because, support went through demand policies to the pharmaceutical industry, but it was successful because it was done in coordination across all of Europe. That's how we got the vaccines developed so fast. And we're seeing now with the energy crisis, similarly, coordination across different countries to deal with the energy crisis in a region like Europe has been particularly vital. So at the same time, this international coordination requires industrial policies, requires other national policies, whether it's on the price of energy, whether it's support to families, but also support of firms that need to face this change, this shock in prices. So, that's why to me, talking about national policy is still very important. But as I said, in this broader context of governance that has to be multi-level, national, regional, especially for larger country, and it has to be especially important on national, international, especially for small open economies, operating, for example, in regional markets and in regional supranational institutions like European Union. So that would be my answer to your first question. The second question was about the breadth of industrial policies. And to me, this is just a recognition of the fact that, we are living more and more in a complex world, and businesses are facing more and more different issues. We are asking businesses, let me make an example, to contribute to achieving sustainable development goals. We ask them to publish special financial reports on how they're achieving sustainable development goals. Now, they might have the potential to do it. They might have the potential to contribute to climate neutrality, but sometimes, especially smaller businesses, either don't have the resources or don't have the knowledge, or they don't have the capacity to achieve these goals. And at the same time, governments need to rely on the business sector to achieve these goals. And the only way we do this is by, having either measures within industrial strategies or this kind of close coordination between policies. Now, your question on the sectoral coverage that we have, it's a reflection of the fact that in many countries, the industrial sector is relatively small and is shrinking, as we all know. And I would also say, from my point of view, distinguish between manufacturing and service is not so clear anymore. So let me make an example on this. The competitiveness of many industrial sectors depends on the effectiveness of the services sector. Machine tools being one, often when countries export machine tools, they don't export only the machine tool, but they export the services that accompany this machine tool, the engineering services, the maintenance services, the training services that go, and that's, for example, the model of many, even small, let me make the example of Italy, but we could make the same example of Germany. Italy has been exporting machine tools, for example, to China, but, they were not just exporting the machine. They sent people there to teach how to use those machines, how to repair those machines, and so on. So having an effective manufacturing service goes hand in hand with having an effective services sector, number one. Number two, we also know, because of the input-output linkages, that you cannot have a productive manufacturing service without having an efficient services sector, because most of the inputs that come domestically to your manufacturing sectors are domestic services. So that, to me, is an important linkage, and that's why, for me, talking of industrial policies as just being manufacturing in the current economy, I would not, encourage, I would say, this interpretation. I think the third question that you had was about global value chains and what are the policy measures that can be used given the current geopolitical situation. But I would also say the challenges that we have seen at the beginning of the COVID crisis with the disruption of global value chain. And to me, governments have two choices. One is mitigating the risk of the shock. Secondly, facilitating adaptation. Okay. Now, the risk mitigation could be, for example, happening by diversifying suppliers, so limiting the importance of concentration and dependence of few suppliers. That's a bit what we are seeing, although it takes time and sometimes it's not something that can adjust instantly to the shock, is what's happening, for example, in many European countries vis-a-vis Russian gas and oil. It's like you try to diversify your supplier, going to Algeria, going to Norway, and so on. The second one is very much about adaptation. And again, this is something that many are trying to do with nearshoring, reshoring. But I would say this is also where innovation and industrial policy in a more traditional sense, technology policy, can play an important role. And let me make an example here. Europe has this HEIC, high, oh God, I'm bad with acronyms, but these are important projects of high strategic importance in Europe. So what they're trying to do, for example, is to agree at an international level on developing batteries, for example, cars in Europe, rather than having to rely on Chinese batteries for cars. So this, I would say, it's more about let's adapt, let's develop our own technology, but that takes a longer time. Or a final, more quick way of adapting is we need to start increasing our stocks, and so our inventories, which has, as take to solve the crisis. Okay, thank you for this very interesting question. So let me perhaps make a point. In the last, I would say, 20 years in many countries, we have seen this slowdown in productivity, and we have seen at the same time this increase in divergence, which I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. So the question that one might pose is, how are the two related? And I mean, we have an ongoing paper that we're going to present at the Working Party on Industry Analysis, showing that actually the two are very much related. And the biggest problem, I would say, comes from the fact that this divergence is driven by a slowdown in diffusion of technology. So what we are seeing, as I showed you, is that, things at the very top of the distribution are going okay. Large firms are growing, becoming more profitable, bigger, they continue to innovate. At the bottom, this is not happening anymore. Firms find it very hard to come in. That's why we have the slowdown in entry rate. And they don't grow, so they stagnate. So for me, there are two important messages here. We need to allow for entry, and so support entry through entrepreneurship policies. And these entrepreneurship policies can go from improving the whole entrepreneurship ecosystem, the linkages with universities, for example, and trying to incentivize as well the licensing of technologies from university to start up. And we know that even in many countries, this is an issue, and the market for this licensing is very, might not be functioning as well as we want, because we are creating, for example, in the US reality, monopolies with TLOs. Sometimes there is poor knowledge of the value of technology. So a lot can be done in that area, sort of the technology development to technology commercialization from universities, and the link between universities and startup. So that it's an important one. The financing, development of venture capital is still something that many governments are trying to support, and I think more can be done also in the design on how this support is done. There is evidence that hybrid system, mixed public and private funding seem to be working quite well. So that could be a second area in this. The third one is exit policy. So if you want to have this creative distraction type of process, you also need to allow firms to exit. And so bankruptcy legislation and bankruptcy regulation is something that needs to be sort of designed in a way that, mistakes are not published, and people can try, these serial entrepreneurs can actually arise in the economy, because, we know that entrepreneurs learn from their mistakes. So this is on, I would say, the creative distraction process. We could talk more, but let me stop there. The second one is very much about adoption of technologies by incumbent lagging or followers. Let me call them like this. How do we achieve this? Number one, we know from a study that we have done on the human side of productivity that skills are key. So for me, training policy and, in the longer run, education policies are important. Management, which is something, again, that is vital. And the third one, I would say, is also awareness policy. Sometimes there is some reticence because there is a lot of uncertainty. Let me talk about the green. There are lots of costs. Knowledge of regulation is not I would say, advanced, especially among smaller businesses. So this is something where government, again, can play an important role. And sometimes some of these policies are not hugely costly, but they are sometimes inefficient. So you might want to have a one-stop business support measure rather than having, many small support measures. So this is something, the streamlining of support is also very important to I would say, don't overcharge the smaller businesses with too much information, too many places to go. So the streamlining can be, you know, in I would say, a low-cost, efficient way of improving policies for these laggards. R&D support, I would say this is much more important for the catch-up at higher level, and again, perhaps much more in some specific manufacturing sectors. But again, R&D support policy, R&D grants, R&D tax credit can be, you know, we know that they work. Perhaps they're not the most value for money type of support, but they can be particularly relevant. And again, here the importance is the design. Finally, let me also talk about one other thing. The relationship between suppliers and customers is an important one. In many countries, and you know, I think Korea is not perhaps very different, there is a big asymmetry between the size and the power of customers relative to suppliers. And therefore, sometimes suppliers find themselves sort of depending on a very large business. So there might be knowledge diffusion here and knowledge sharing, but there might be, you know, too much risk to innovate for these businesses because, you know, they don't have the incentives and they don't have enough market power to do so. So again, this kind of rebalancing of powers and trying to avoid too much concentration and little competition, to avoid entrenchment at the top, to avoid blocking new innovation and too much acquisition. I think that's an important one. So I'll stop here, but I mean, I could go on for another 10 hours because I mean, there are many things one could do to really, I would say, increase diffusion and effective use of new technologies.